Hi, we would like to start in a minute because we only have an hour. So. Are you Jabber scribing? I mean, you're sort of the default Jabber scriber. If you don't want to, that's fine. Would you? As far as I know, yes, I don't Jabber, so. Oh, and our minutes taker says there's already 4 people there, so. Okay. Okay. Okay, let's get started because we do only have an hour. Hi. So here's the agenda. I'm going to give a brief overview, which is what I'm doing now. I'm going to go through a roll call of, oh, that's right. I keep forgetting. We're in Chicago. I'm going to do a roll call of that I've already collected, and I'm going to zip through it really, really quickly. You'll see why once I get there. So that's another 10 minutes. Mark Nottingham is going to give a 10-minute talk about third-party services. We'll have a little bit of time for clarifying questions after that, but even though that might be sort of a lightning rod, we would rather not block down on that because we'll immediately go into how working groups use GitHub. That'll be Martin Thompson. And then we will definitely have time to talk. No one has given me any presentations on issues, so it'll mostly be what we would normally call a mic line. And we'll be out of here at 10 minutes after 6, and we'll have much more to talk about afterwards. But this is where we're going. So this BOF is in the general area because it's for all of things. So thank you, Yari. Thank you, Alyssa. Be very clear here. This is not a working group forming BOF. This is a hopefully one-time deal where when you have more questions and ideas afterwards, you'll talk to each other. We have a mailing list, which is at the bottom of this slide. But there is no intention to form a working group. We are discussing 2 documents that are already out there. So there will be more discussion of them, but there's no idea to have a working group out of this. So why we're doing this is that we want to have, many people have said, oh, I've heard about this, or we're using GitHub a little bit in our group, or I want to know more, and things like that. Sort of the idea is to socialize it. I mean, this is sort of the old school kind of BOF where we're actually supposed to just sort of say, oh, you're interested in that, I'm interested in that. So here's the obligatory humorous slide because people have been asking me, how do you pronounce it? All of those are valid pronunciations in English. And capitalization counts. Somebody actually asked me about what GitHub is. So, which is perfectly reasonable because they didn't know what Git was. Someone actually earlier asked me about why should they join LinkedIn. And it's the same thing, capitalization counts. So this is the next, hopefully 10 minutes is going to be a whole bunch of slides being blown at you. These are all of the working groups that when I put on the mailing list, I asked, what are you doing? What's your level? And such like that. These are the ones who responded. So it's an incomplete list. The idea here is not for you to write down all the notes of what I'm saying, but to, when you see, if you're interested in using GitHub in your working group and you see a working group that either you're in or that you know about, make a note of that so that you will know those people and such like that. All of this is also being discussed on the mailing list, but this is a way for you to know who's doing what and for whom it's not working necessarily. GitHub is a tool. There are other tools out there, and so some of these slides in the roll call will talk about how they're doing that and why. But so again, just look at these are the highlights, and I will zip through because really what's much more important in this discussion is the next two presentations plus the discussion at the end. So in alphabetical order, ACME uses it. I'm sorry. So here's another acronym for you folks. I meant to spell it out earlier, is PRs, pull requests. If you're not familiar with GitHub, this is a GitHub specific feature. ACME uses pull requests to make changes even within the document authors. That is, they use pull requests, the document authors use pull requests to track among themselves what they are doing and why. They try to track all the issues on the mailing list, and of course the discussion is on the list. Anima uses it for some things, and it's mostly just a simple, repository kind of thing. GeoJSON, part of the reason why they use this is that the community was using GitHub before they came to the IETF, which is a good reason to use a tool. If you already know how to use a power tool, that's a good reason to use that power tool and not to go back to hammers. The HRPC has all of their documents, including the documents like for meetings and such, on GitHub. They noted here that the repo is actually owned by one of the co-chairs. This is a funny question that you have to ask, is when you create a GitHub repo for a working group, who owns it, who doesn't own it, who gets to change things and such like that. So they noted that the repo is owned by one of the co-chairs. And they also noted that there's no single place where issues are being tracked. That, of course, sucks, but it's also common even in groups that don't use GitHub. HTTP BIS, the poster child. So all working group, and I say that, and we will have the next two presentations are from people heavily active, and they don't agree on its use in HTTP BIS. But all of the working group drafts are in a single GitHub repo. All issues are tracked there. They also have the working group homepage there. So when you go to the working group homepage, you actually end up on GitHub. You can tell they really, really like this. The materials and the agenda stuff are also on GitHub. So they pretty much are using this as the home place for everything. And they have for quite a while. And for those of you not familiar with HTTP BIS, they just pushed out maybe a year ago a large raft of documents that all had a lot of interconnections. And they used GitHub also to track the interconnections. So there's a whole bunch of IoT groups that use GitHub for their documents. And one of the things that's common here with them is that because a lot of the IoT groups interact with groups outside the IETF, it turns out that having all of their stuff or having a lot of their stuff on GitHub actually makes it more easily accessible to people who are outside the IETF who don't want to be on our mailing list and such like that. And so the Open Connectivity Foundation, OCF, seem to like that. So that's a thing to note. MMusic are using it a little bit, but the working group isn't. Quick, everything happens on GitHub because Quick is part of HTTP BIS. Nope, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. Yeah. So that was the second humor slide. But and a few things that aren't on GitHub, they say they are moving to GitHub. So again, very, very active use for Quick. RTC Web, they said, yeah, most of the docs are on GitHub. TLS specifically said some, but not all the documents are there. TLS 1.3, something near and dear to many people's hearts. They are using the GitHub issue tracker and pull requests extensively. Meaning that if you say, I want to see this text, they really want to see that as a pull request in GitHub and to track things that way. But TLS working group also has a couple of other drafts and not so much that they're using GitHub on that. Trans has just one draft on it. And humorously here, they actually track the issues with Track, which is the IETF-sponsored tracking that only a small number of working groups still use, but they're using GitHub for the document itself. So that's a split use. Web push, sort of normal. Some of the drafts and issues are in GitHub, discussion on the mailing list. Okay, so that was it for the roll call, and I think I did that in under 10 minutes. So again, the idea there is if you saw a working group you were interested in, and they might have more information, they might have experience, go find them, and let's move forwards. I'm sorry? Oh yeah, there's probably other, like I said at the beginning, there were ones who just didn't, you know, say anything, but and some of the ones who didn't say anything will also have interesting side notes. So we're not trying to, you know, collect a completely composite list here, but we want this to be useful for all of you. So are you running to the mic? Okay, quickly.
Alex Afanasyev from UCLA. I just want to mention the ICNRG research group also using GitHub for some of the drafts.
Okay, so yeah, so that's another research group they're using. So let's move on to, you know, how working groups are allowed to use third-party services. I pulled this pretty much directly out of the abstract so that Mark could take his time to get up to the mic. And now I will switch to Mark's slides.
Please collect your printed out internet drafts into IETF journals and put them in a pile and light them on fire. Please.
Oh wait, sorry, that's the wrong M. Sorry.
Thank you. Mine are not nearly as well designed as Martin's.
That's right, because you don't know. Yeah, okay, go ahead. Go for it. Yep.
Okay, so we've been using GitHub in HTTP, the working group, for quite some time. I think we were the first, or at least one of the first, to use GitHub, and certainly one of the first to use it so aggressively. I should have known that being in this room. It's cold and people want you close to the mic. Do you want me to like, okay. If you tell me to stand on my head, I'm going to say no. So in the process of doing that and then replicating, you know, that tool set for the Quick working group, which we're just started up more recently, and a couple of other working groups that I've been working in, the one thing that I've noticed is that, you know, we have people come up regularly and say, well, but this isn't the way we've done it before, and are you sure you can do that, or I want to do it this way. And that's a very reasonable response. When I first started using it for HTTP, I went to my area director, who I think at the time was Barry, and said, is it okay if we do this? And he thought about it, and we talked through it a little bit, and he said, yes, sure. And that was great. So I had a little bit of air cover, but, you know, that was just an agreement between me and him, and we talked to the working group about it. It seems to me that it would be nice to have a more structured approach to what you can and cannot do when using these third-party tools, because this session really isn't just about GitHub to me. Even the people who are just using GitHub often are using things like CI systems, and that's another third-party tool, and it has its own set of considerations. So to my thinking, next slide. Let's go to the next slide. To my thinking, you know, one thing we should be talking about in all of this is what are the foundational principles that we think about when we use a third-party tool like GitHub. I use tools and services kind of interchangeably here because we don't really have a terminology for this yet. And so, you know, that's good for the people who are new to the working group or who want to engage casually and they're used to engaging in other mechanisms in the IETF, in that they'll have more assurance that this working group is operating in a way that they can easily understand, that they're using tools in a way that is you know, equitable. And also it's good for the working group who wants to use these tools because, you know, you need some amount of air cover. You need some sort of guidance that you're doing this in a way that's reasonable for the IETF. If you mess this up, it can be very bad. If we use a tool in an inappropriate way, then, you know, and people feel that they're disadvantaged in the process, that can break down the entire process, you know, and the guarantees we have being in the standards body. So having some rigor on this, I think, would be good. Next slide. I did not try and address specific tools or practices or give general advice in this draft because really documenting those principles is all I wanted to do. I think that once we figure out what they are, they're relatively long-lived and we can put them in a BCP or a comparable document and let them sit there. Whereas the advice about using GitHub in particular is going to evolve pretty continuously for a long period of time. And it may be that an RFC is the best output for that. It may be that a wiki is the best output for that. We can talk about that later. So next slide, please. These are the ones that the draft talks about, and in the best IETF tradition, I'm not going to regurgitate the draft to you. If you're interested in this, you can go and read the draft. It's not very long, but it's just a list of high-level principles of the things we look for when we want to use a third-party tool to make sure that we're using it in an appropriate way. And that's really all I had. I can talk through these a little bit if folks want, but that was the proposal that I made. Now, Paul said that this is not a working group forming BOF. I think probably to do something like this, we would need some instrument that was appropriate to come to consensus on what those principles are. But I did want to get it in front of people. Any questions, especially
so clarifying questions now, bigger questions for later, but clarifying questions would be okay. We still have certainly some time.
Yeah,
Bernie Volts. You know, one of the things is that how do you define working group use as something? You know, if for example, like, you know, there's for the DHC working group, we do use GitHub, but we don't really, you know, use it in a broad working group context. We use it more for the two co-chairs to sort of work together and have like a single place to put information and things like that. Mm-hmm. You know, and we have used it for like a few documents where there was a group of authors that, you know, needed stuff. So, you know, and we didn't really think about, oh, this is going to be a big issue because, you know, these are just tools that we're using. So, you know, how do you define a working group's use versus sort of this non-private use, or do you include that private use in this definition?
I kind of, you know, when you ask that, two things come to mind. One is that if a participant, you know, would reasonably think that they need to interact with that tool to participate in the working group, that's using that tool. And the other is if you form a hard dependency on the tool where, you know, you have significant investment in that tool, and if it gets taken away one day, then you've got a problem as a working group. That probably means you're using that tool too. Okay,
because we make it, you know, it's publicly readable. It's just the people that can make changes are controlled, because these are all, you know, they are sort of IETF related work products and things like that. So,
and to be clear, this list here, I don't think it's a particularly high bar. I can't imagine that anybody who's currently using GitHub is going to have a significant problem with any of these.
Yeah. Okay.
Eric Klein, can you just give a brief definition of what you mean by recoverability?
I mean that if, for example, using GitHub, if they were to plow into the ground tomorrow and lose all their data, or you know, get sued in submission, that your working group's work is not lost.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Or if they started charging $40 billion per user or something. You know.
Kyle Rose, not just work, but history, right? It's not just not just the output, but also all the discussion and the pull requests and whatnot.
Yes. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks. Martin. Let's swap here. Creative slides.
They're just pictures. So part of the point of this draft was to act as a target. So hence the slide. So Mark was talking about the larger context. We talk a little bit about other tools, but obviously at this point, the primary tool that we're talking about is GitHub. I want to talk about the specifics in a little more detail here. And I'm not actually going to talk about the draft for a little while, because I think, though Paul did a great job of the introduction here, I want to sort of talk about some of the philosophy that sort of goes behind this. So next, please. Mark covered the history. I believe that it was the first working group that actually used GitHub, in the sense that you had to, in order to participate in any meaningful way, you had to use the tool. And that's something that was new. We were tracking issues there, but we weren't actually doing any discussion. But it meant that people had to visit GitHub to get the state of the working group. And that was really sort of the first time that we did that. And as an editor on those specs, I used GitHub pretty heavily, and we saw a lot of contributions there. That was successful, so other people followed. And when we have a long roll call already. You probably only covered like a quarter of the working groups in that. I don't think all the people here would indicate that there's something more than the mere 8 or 10 that you actually had there. So next. So the question about what it is that we do here and how we do it is kind of important. We talk a lot about the what we do and why we do it, but the how is kind of critical. And I think we have some reasonably good processes for deciding what work that we do and forming working groups and how we select chairs and editors and all those sorts of other things. That's pretty well understood now. But this part's the next part, and I think we can talk about improving the process overall. Next. So the underlying principle here that we're working on is that I'm looking for is I would like us to start building RFCs the way we build software, and thinking about it in some of the same terms, not necessarily all of the same terms. We don't necessarily want to pick up all of the baggage that we have there, but start to think about it in the same sort of terms. So next. And I think that the target that we're looking for here as an organization is we want high quality open source software. I mean, the RFCs that we develop are essentially as open as they possibly could be, and we're looking to meet a certain bar of quality. Next, so what does it actually mean? Yeah, that. We don't necessarily, we're not looking for ISO 9000 certification here or anything like that.
We also don't build software that meets it, so that's okay.
Right. My training's out of date on that, but really, no. But some of the principles there actually do apply in terms of, do you have a reproducible process? Do you actually understand what process you use to produce the output that you have? All of those sorts of questions come in. Next. So to some extent, a lot of this relies on the degree of quality assurance that we have. And we have a bunch of processes in place that allow us to control the quality of the output that we have. And we have cross-area review teams, directorates, and the likes. We use IDNITs to sort of do the sort of low-level basic checking. Shepherds, automation. But we actually see some working groups are taking this a little further than this. And I think that the working groups that are producing Yang models are actually pretty far ahead on this. They actually have tools that take the schema documents they have and turn them into the text that's in the documents. They have automated validation for those things, and pretty good tool chain around these sorts of things. And I saw at previous hackathons and some pretty impressive work in that area. So there's some interesting things that we could potentially be doing in that sort of space. Next. So one of the principles that I'm particularly fond of is this notion that you continuously validate what it is that you've produced, and this is something that I'd like to get in the process. Some of those people who are using some of the tools that are available for GitHub are actually now taking advantage of the fact that the document produces valid text every commit. That's something that I've worked on. We can enable that. If people are generating pull requests against the quick spec, you will actually see a little red mark down the bottom if you've done something wrong and it's not able to produce a valid document out of the changes that you've made. And so that's valuable. That keeps the process nice and smooth. It's essentially grease on the wheel, but it's a pretty low bar to meet. There are specifications in this organization that actually include code. Not a great deal, but some of them a lot. It would be nice if that code actually compiled when we ship it. And ensuring that that continues to remain true is something that would be interesting as well. The fact that the code is correct is probably something that would be hard to do, but the The tests don't actually need to sit in the RFC, but they might need to exist, is my suggestion there. And another thing that we often run into, particularly in some of the more complex documents that produce lengthy examples, I'm thinking in particular here SIP or some of the mail examples, or those documents that have a large amount of XML in them, for instance, it's really nice if the examples in those documents are actually correct based on the definitions in the documents. And those people who are using schema languages to express what it is that they're doing can take advantage of automatic validation. And the underlying principle here is keep it short. Make sure that you learn about these things quickly. Next. So this is my very crude diagram showing how it is that we produce a document. At the moment, our major forms of feedback into this process are the two big orange lines. Those happen after we publish revisions to drafts, and they happen at meetings. And it tends to happen that, next slide, that the feedback cycle is about this long. And
you are here now.
Right. Welcome. Thank you for all participating. We thank you for joining us once every 4 months for this. That's kind of bad. Next slide. The real validation we get for these things is when people actually implement and deploy them. Turns out that doesn't happen anywhere near often enough. One of the reasons I think that the HTTP2 work was successful was two things. One is that we reduced the 4-month loop to effectively a 2-month loop. And the other was that we did this implement and deploy thing. Was it the third meeting that we had twitter.com running it or something? It was crazy. Yeah, so I'll repeat what Mark said. We were chartered at the beginning of the year. The implementation draft went out in June, and it was deployed in August. 10 implementations at that time. Not 10 deployments, but yeah. And we were sitting at an interim discussing some changes, and someone said, oh yeah, I'll have that on twitter.com tomorrow morning. And we were like, okay, maybe slow down, dude. Next slide. So part of the problem here is that we have humans in the loop. In order to turn a specification into code, you need someone to actually write the code, and it's not usually a trivial task. The hackathon is a huge improvement in this regard. We're actually getting some really good feedback on this, on our processes and our development. NetVC neatly avoid this problem by making the code the specification, and Opus did the same thing. I wouldn't recommend that for everyone. So to get back to the crux of the issue, fast early feedback is something that I'm looking for, and that's patching those early phases so that we can get the feedback cycle happening a lot quicker. And that is when people discuss particular issues, having text to go with that discussion is often extremely valuable. And I found that those discussions in working groups where there's a pull request associated with them and text associated with them tend to be a lot more efficient and effective. And even if you're not doing that, simply having access to the editor's copy of a document that is being updated with whatever the editor has currently managed to do is a huge advantage. It means that those people working in the working group who are actively involved are tracking the discussion, and the current state of the document is as close to as is possible to the current state that's in everyone's heads. And so you're not dealing with a 4-month-old document that doesn't reflect where everyone's minds have gone in the intervening space. Next. On a completely separate topic, it also turns out that venues like GitHub have other people sitting there already, people who have never come to one of these meetings or would not be inclined to. But nonetheless, drive on by and send you a pull request. And that has been surprisingly good. It has saved me a lot of typos. I'll have to say that much. And what's more, it's really easy to handle these contributions because they come in the form of a pull request, and all you need to do is check that it's sane and press a button. And that is quite a powerful thing.
Can you briefly explain how that works with the blue sheets?
So the question was, how does that work with the blue sheets? I'm not sure how this...
IETF has done a pull request and you accepted it, and now it's in the system. Where is this?
Oh, so you're concerned about ownership? Yeah. So we now know.
Well, actually, we only have a couple more slides, and then we do have plenty of time.
Yeah, so maybe we can take this up after that. Next, please. Oh, one of the things that has been hugely useful, we've found, particularly when we've come to the end of the process and we start to get wider review from people, new people start coming into working groups implementing these things, is they ask questions and they say, why is it like this? And we now have the tools available to us to go back, find the issues that we were using, identify the discussion that was happening. It's a lot easier to do that with an issue tracker rather than trying to search through mail archives. And you can actually see why you made that particular change and who made that change. And that's a pretty powerful thing. As I said, threading in context is kind of important. And I find that having discussion in context has been quite useful and quick. So we decided at some point to move from the model where the issues were merely being tracked in GitHub to actually allowing substantive discussion on GitHub, and that's been pretty valuable too. And as I said, minor changes are much easier to handle. So you avoid typos because when you make a pull request, people comment on it and say, look, you've got a typo there, and you fix it. Or if the typo escapes that phase, you get a pull request. And most of the contributions from drive-bys have been simply clarifications, fixing grammar, realigning the stupid ASCII art that we've been forced to draw, those sorts of things. And so it's not the problem that Paul was concerned about. It's not been an issue thus far, but it's certainly one worth discussing. I think that's all I have. Oh yeah, I'm supposed to remind people of what's actually in the draft. Next is, it basically says what it is, how to decide to use it, what to use it for. It says some of the same things that Mark's draft does, although I think Mark's draft sort of covers it more cleanly, particularly with the principles that he's outlined. It does have some more specific advice on how to manage things, and also some general blathering about various things. It was never intended to be published. As the stocks at the front indicated, it was meant as a target. Someone was threatening to have a working a BOF. And
feel like
I was going to say working
threat,
group. There was a threat of having a BOF with no documents or no substantial targets for discussion, and I thought that was just not on. So I put this together, and thanks to Aaliyah for actually fixing it, because it was in a dire state before she fixed most of that. So it was pretty bad. Let's be frank. So there's a whole lot of blathering in there. And it also has one other thing. GitHub is not available over IPv6. So the community can shed a tear.
So actually, Martin and Mark, why don't, instead of people saying things to me and you running up each time, why don't you guys just stand in the pink box together and you answer everything?
Should we hold hands? Well, please do.
You're so cute together in the box. So this is Pete Resnick.
And by the way, just as a point, we have about 15 or 20 minutes. And I assume we're going to fill it with the mic line. Do pay attention to, we do have a mailing list. I'm sure this is going to generate stuff for the mailing list, but feel free to mic line for about 15 or 20 minutes more. Thanks.
So this is Pete Resnick. I think I'm not going to say anything you'll disagree with particularly here, but it struck me that what Martin, you described as the way that the process is going and gotten much better due to use of GitHub is exactly the way the process was when I started. But it was because back then, Mail and Usenet were the ways that we collaborated on stuff. And so the switch to GitHub is simply we're starting to use the ways that engineers are collaborating on stuff again. And the only thing I would say then as sort of a direction is let's not go through this process again where we get stuck on a tool because all of us in this community love that tool. And then when new people start coming into the community, they look at us and go, why are you using that stupid tool? Some sort of agility with our, our use of different tools, different ways of working together. So, but that continue to plug into, at the end of the day, we have something stable that we can point to and say, that's what we mean for now as the standard.
And by the way, just Pete, even though you have been here forever, you didn't say your name, and we do. Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't. And yeah, we do have a minutes taker. So yes, please. Sorry, I missed it.
Mike Bishop. So I will say, the HTTP working group being my first working group coming into, I kind of saw this from the beginning, and I didn't know the old process, but I wasn't familiar with GitHub either. So it has been surprisingly good to collaborate there, although I had to learn Git in the process. The thing that has been most frustrating to me, particularly now that I'm a doc editor in Quick, is we don't really have an agreed way to reach consensus. And so we continue to have this IETF process that consensus is on the mailing list, consensus is not in meetings, consensus is not on GitHub. And so we have something like 100-ish resolved issues in Quick, and we have formal consensus on one.
So with my Quick working group chair hat on,
Yes.
co-chair, Lars is out there.
You're about to say we don't even have it on that one.
We just started. As you know, I put out a call for consensus about a week ago on, how many were there?
Too many.
Way too many issues. So we have been feeling our way through this process, and I put a link onto the Jabber, which is another way that we communicate here at the IETF.
Another tool nobody else uses.
To our contributing document, which is, we started this in HTTP working group where GitHub allows you to have a file in the repo that is automatically shown to people or linked to people when they create an issue or do certain things on the repo. And this is the terms of contribution. And we've kind of evolved that over time to be, this is how you participate in this working group. This is how we get to consensus in this working group. And if folks are on the Jabber channel, I'd encourage you to read that because that reflects how we're working right now in terms of getting to that. But I think your feedback there is good. That makes me more concerned about the state we charted Quick in than anything else. Yeah.
Well, I really just want to see in whatever drafts wind up being produced here, if it's a BCP or whatever, is consensus still determined on the mailing list? And if so, what is the flow?
Oh, I was going to say,
sorry. Are you happy with the way we've currently documented it for Quick? Because that's the best we've got right now.
Yeah, the thing that frustrates me with Quick is I feel like we've gotten into a process, I mean, admittedly only in draft 02, of we have all the proposed resolutions in this draft, speak now or forever hold your peace.
It's never like that. It's always, if we get more information and that has a broad definition, you can reopen an issue.
Ted Hardy, I chair RDC Web and Acme, both of which use GitHub in very different ways. And one of the things I'd like to point out is that I think Pete's point about don't get caught in a tool for all time needs to be extended slightly to understand that you may use different tools not just for different working groups, but for different life cycle points in a working group. And I'll point out that in HTTP, nobody suggested going to GitHub while we were still in the here are these 3 candidate drafts stage, right? The later you are in the process, the more appropriate the GitHub style of we already have the structure and we're making contributions to it, et cetera, the more natural it feels, at least to me. And if you're really still at the stage where somebody may need to say, nope, this whole approach is wrong, they're not going to do that as a giant PR, emptying and replacing a document. They have to do it as a new document. And so there's yeah, it's been done, Richard points out to me. Thank you for the information.
So Ted, I'll point out that the W3C does this on occasion. Were you there for my chicken draft on?
Yes, I was. It was excellent, but the point is, let's not either get stuck on using this particular tool or assume we have to use the same tool through the life cycle of a working group. Because it may very well be that this is a very useful tool for authors in the early stage and then becomes a working group tool after adoption when things get later along. And that sort of evolution should be part of how we think about it as well.
Hello, I'm Benoit Claes. So I like what you wrote, right? Having RFC, producing RFC the same way we produce software. So you mentioned the Yang tools and explain what I'm doing there and what my main pain point is. So what I'm doing is that every day I'm looking at all the drafts, the new ones. I run a tool to extract the Yang module. Then I validate this, then I report the errors to the authors. Now, what's happening is that the thing which is very stupid here is that we're asking people to create a Yang module, to insert it into a TXT file, which is posted, then I extract it, then I report errors on the lines, and then the lines are not the same one that the original one, because, you know, extra lines, whatever, because of the footer. My biggest issue here is that we should distinguish the draft from something which is in there, like a module, a MIP, some code. This one, if it would be in GitHub, that would help me a lot.
I happen to have an unsubmitted draft on that I will submit after this meeting.
To GitHub?
It's currently on GitHub. It's currently on GitHub. You can read it there. You might have trouble finding it in the 100 or so repositories that I have. But it covers the issue that you're talking about. And I think one of the ways that GitHub and this setup can actually help with your problem is that you don't have to extract the module from the text document, because you know that the authors of that document were generating the module, validating the module, then inserting it into the document, and you can be really reasonably sure that that process was followed properly because it was all automated. And I can show you how to set that up. I actually have a draft in the TLS working group that has a markdown file that says, please run the following test cases in NSS. And it scrapes the test cases for test vectors and then generates the draft out of that.
That's fine. What I'm doing with Yang is that I have even commercial tools to validate those, right? So it will be sometimes impossible to just say, this is the list of things that you have to validate. So I believe that the IETF should take the highest priority to separate those two.
Oh, yeah. That is a point that I make in my draft too. Yeah.
Okay.
For some definition of fixed.
Yes. Where we means Joe and I. Yes, right.
Hi, Dave Crocker. So I get the degree of adoption that has already happened, and that makes moot any concerns one might raise about whether it should be adopted. So any comments I'm going to make aren't raising that question, even if they might sound like they are. We stuck with text only for RFCs for dramatically longer than anybody would have thought was a good idea. And we didn't just do it because we were encrusted in it. There was a facility with it and an ease of access, an accessibility that was profound and still is. And in spite of the fact that we're now using XML as a base, we're actually producing text documents. And I'm amused by the fact that the HTML version that we produce is only a slight variation of the ASCII version. We don't even use pretty HTML to the extent we could. This conservativeness in transitioning over to more powerful and more complex tools is something that we can forget the benefit of. The barrier to entry with GitHub compared to the barrier to entry of generating, forgive me, a text document is huge. So the benefits are significant, but we can get lost in the enthusiasm of that, forgetting that we've just raised the bar for entry. I don't know where to go with that concern other than up here raising the flag about it. And some of the comments being made, I think, reduced to, we need to figure out more careful discipline for using this. It doesn't, I say more careful. I don't mean that people are doing anything wrong. I think that we're not necessarily thinking carefully enough about the selectivity that we might want to have. And there's any number of comments that I think fit into that view. I'm suggesting that we take a beat in thinking about it more carefully. And this, I'm assuming this event is actually in the service of that goal.
Very much so. We've put a fair amount of thought into that. So I'd encourage you to look at the link that I gave out on Jabber. We've been very conscious to make sure that someone who does not want to use one of these tools has legitimate ways that they can participate in the activity. And I'd actually push back on your characterization that we're raising the bar. For many, many people, we are dramatically lowering the bar. And that shows that we're getting implementers and users who otherwise don't know how to engage with us because they don't want to sign up to a fire hose of a mailing list, able to come in and use a tool that they're very familiar with, go and talk about their issue, and then get out.
And to add to that, the process by which you produce a text document that the submission tool will accept is torturous if you don't have access to tools that help you in that process. And we do have some pretty good tools now that allow you to do something as simple as write some markdown and throw it at the wall, and it tends to stick at that point as opposed to bounce off and hit you in the face.
Okay, thanks.
Joe Hildebrand. I just wanted to point out one more thing about the contributing document that you've got. It does, I think, have a link to the NoteWell in it. And I just wanted to point out that there's really no way to either send a PR or file an issue without having seen the NoteWell. So that's for the people who are concerned about, Blue Sheet style issues. That's at least one of the mitigations for that. And we can track you back to your account on GitHub if you send a pull request or file an issue.
Actually, Michael, before you start, you said Blue Sheet, Joe. Who has not signed the Blue Sheet? Okay.
Join us. Come. No.
There's room.
There's room.
So mine is Michael Richardson. Can you go back to the diagram with the circle, the last iteration circle with the really tight loop?
You're asking me to do significant things here. Okay.
I think.
Yeah.
Was it even in your document? Maybe it was in.
This one. Yeah.
It was in the previous one. Oh, there we go. Yeah, that one. That one.
So the answer is yes, I can.
Yes, you can. Thank you. So, so something that I think that is a big deal is that despite the loveliness of the green loop, the loop through the meeting still exists, and it's I think it can be a little bit jarring to a design team that has been iterating quite quickly. For instance, the Anima Bootstrap design team, we had weekly conference calls, and we actually are, while we're not using our make file, we're using one that we found simpler and less capable and more suited to our stupidity. That we were doing that, and that was great. And I said very consciously, I said, oh my goodness, we're going to go talk to a working group, half of whom hasn't read our document, of course, and so doesn't know what changes we're talking about and why we changed our mind 6 times between each Tuesday, right, of our meeting. And so I think this is the part of the problem that we have between, say, for instance, where Dave Crocker is and this is that we're iterating an awfully fast there. And that's good. But that we have an impedance mismatch with a larger group and this kind of thing. So one of the things that I did is I would actually publish an awfully long email, 500 lines or something long, which was our notes of our thing. And I would try to condense our diffs and things that we did back to the mailing list. And now and then there's someone pulls something out of it right in the middle, and there's a big rat hole there that they want to talk about. And that's good because they paid attention to read that far. And I think if you're not doing that, then you're probably making a mistake and you're causing impedance mismatch. And so that's, I think, the caution that we need to figure out how to make that a common activity.
Yeah. So I found that in this situation, it's really almost crucial in some circumstances to take the changes that you think are significant and take them to the list and just move them across there, say, I've opened the following pull request, we've had some discussion there, we think this is the right way forward, and describe the pros and cons and your thinking and how you got to this point in a concise email that identifies that issue. And I found that drawing the larger group into that particular conversation does a lot to validate the designs earlier rather than waiting for the eventual explosion when people go, hey,
and that's the origin of my rant a few weeks ago about being shy about posting your internet drafts, because there was this fast cycle. And I said, can we just post this now? Before we process this pull request that's controversial, let's get the thing out so that the diff tool can really clearly say to people, and here was the controversial change between version 4 and version 5. And the other stuff between version 3 and version 4 was editorial, nitpicky, blah, blah, blah. We reformatted this, we moved some text here, we did that. And just do that and not wait till the Monday or 2 weeks ago to do it, or 1 week ago. That's where the origin of my rant, because I was actually trying to get my co-authors in some cases, like, can we just publish this already? And their reluctance, and in some cases academics who just wouldn't publish a 0.0 until it was perfect. And I'm like, oh, come on, you keep changing your mind. Can we have some points so I can point at the thing I liked the version 3 versions ago, not the version 6 git commits under hash ID, blah, 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 whatever, right? And I just wanted to be able to do that. So I think that's what I want to say is I think this is wonderful, and I've been doing it for as long as you have, for my own stuff, but that we got to still respect the rest of the loop.
I think we're still finding our way on the right pace to publish drafts at. One thing that you actually brought to mind was that I find we don't need design teams as much with this process. That the GitHub issues actually become little miniature design teams that self-coalesce, and you don't need to have this formalism where you break off and then bring something back.
Harald Alvestran. Speaking of some experience in the W3C of doing GitHub, one of the things that has not been mentioned is the actual properties of a bug tracker. One of the things we did was we switched from Bugzilla to GitHub's issue tracker. And it was very clear from the ease of using the two tools that less is definitely more. So I've come to appreciate this in most things in building process, which is that often the best process is the one that isn't there. Switching points. There's a short line behind me. Consensus on issues has very frequently, in our context, been the mailing list knows that the issue has been raised, the mailing list knows that there has been a resolution, and the two people who really care agree with the solution. That's a very practical way of measuring consensus, and this works fairly well with GitHub issues. Now, this doesn't fit the description that is in the RFCs that IETF lives and dies by. But I think it's, in practice, quite useful. What we should be sure of is that anyone who follows the work cannot claim to have been surprised if he has read the standard means of communication. As long as he cannot claim to be surprised, I think that the point of consensus has been preserved, even though the RFCs are icky about it.
So Keith, before you step up to the mic, we have 5 minutes left. Area directors, Alyssa or Yari, do you have anything that you want to inject since we only have 5 minutes left? Okay. Okay, great. Sorry, go ahead then.
Okay, I'm Keith Moore. I'll try to be brief. I do have 2 points. In no particular order. When the slide was up there that says we want to develop documents like we do open source software, my first thought was, but good open source software and a good standards document really have very different characteristics. And the tools that you use to collaborate affect the product in both good and bad ways. I actually think this is a great idea and I want to see it explored. I'm not trying to discourage use of these tools, but a good standards document in my mind has coherence. And that means that editors have gone through and made decisions about what to include and what not to include. And often a standard is better when it has fewer features. And one of the problems I've seen both with collaboratively edited documents and with open source software that had a lot of contributors is creeping featureism. And I don't think that's a good thing for a standard. So I'm interested to see how you can, take the process and use these tools in such a way that doesn't contribute to creeping featureism in standards.
Yeah, just to respond to that, Keith, I've worked in a number of different standards organizations, and this is probably the one place that I've been that doesn't suffer from that. All of the other standards bodies that I've participated in have massive problems with feature creep. And I think this is just a product of the maturity of the people involved and the culture and the discipline that's applied to the development of the standard. I don't think it's got a great deal to do with the tools. I've seen the W3C work on things. They use GitHub. They use a very similar process to what we're using in HTTP, and yet they produce sometimes documents that are just as creepy as you could imagine.
I don't think
I meant
tools,
creepy, by the way.
I don't think the tools necessarily. I guess I would say that to the extent that we have that coherence, it's because there is a document editor or a small number of document editors who are dedicated to making that happen, and I don't want to lose that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's actually something that my document talks about a little bit. I didn't mention it here, but I should have, which is that one of the properties that we're actually getting is that the editors become custodians of the document rather than actually being responsible for writing all of the text. And that is a huge advantage for editors, particularly being an editor on a number of those documents.
Okay.
But you still have that level of editorial review.
Okay.
That's great.
Second point is that anytime I've ever had to try to assess this sort of mental state, all of the ideas and the decisions taken and this kind of thing, and there's been multiple sources of this information that were in disparate places, it becomes a problem. So I think doing it when everything was done on the mailing list, you knew where to find all this stuff. It was all on the mailing list. If you have some things in GitHub and some things in a bug tracking system and some things on the mailing list, I think that potentially becomes a bigger problem. So just something to think about.
And that they all end up in my inbox anyway. Everything ends up in my inbox anyway, so it's all the same to me.
So
Alex,
we're rapidly running out of time, so if we can keep those short.
Very quick. So one, I want to echo back the contribution, or like a blue sheet one. So I think you already mentioned that the GitHub has a facility to specify contribution guide, which you have to accept, and which is standard for all open source software. You have to accept some contribution guide in order to contribute. And the second one, I like GitHub. GitHub is a great tool, but I'm not sure that the recoverability for issues and pull requests is either possible or available at this moment.
It is possible we do it.
Okay.
So, and we'll have, if you come to the mailing list, there will be discussion on the tools to do that.
So, Colin Jennings, I'm a fan of all this and think you can solve these problems easily, but I think that you need to take the IPR problems very serious, and that many of us are being sued right now over a lawsuit that will largely turn on whether somebody was in violation of BC 78 or not. And it's a lot of money, and it's going to be traced back to actual people. And when it's blue sheets, it's easy to do in this here. There's a community, you know that. But when it's, XX27 on GitHub, it's really hard to correlate that with a real person's name. So I want us to move to those types of tools and take things from people that maybe we never meet in person. But I think that we have to be able to actually address the legal issues that come out of that as well.
Yeah. So the W3C actually has an interesting process.
It could, but it typically didn't. Right. And we're moving to a time where we're hoping it typically does.
Well, as Martin said, the pull requests we're taking now tend to be drive-by spelling checks. When it's a meteor feature, they have to get more involved in the discussion itself.
Well, all I'm saying is I think we have to get very serious in looking at this experience of educating our editors on what's major and what's not major, okay, which I suspect that from Martin's look, he doesn't know. And then the other thing is looking at the what for the ones that are major, what is our bar? So W3C has a very clear one, right? And they understand it and they have tools that enforce it. We can have all those things. I'm not suggesting we need that. I think these are problems we can solve easily. I'm just saying we need to solve them. That's all.
So I'd like to push back just a little bit on that. I think I agree with the general sentiment. All we have right now is an email address from some participants. True? We also have the same in GitHub. When someone makes a contribution, an actual material contribution, we have the same.
Just not even necessarily, not if they delete their GitHub account, because we're involved in one of those.
No, you actually get that in the metadata, and it's recorded in the.
My only point
is,
even with the email address, I don't think it's the email address that was necessarily important in here. I mean, I use Fluffy at III but even though often my stuff is Cisco, I think that often we do through the community process of participating in meetings know who the people are and know and makes it somewhat different, and that we're trying to make that more remote and accessible to more people. It's a good thing, but we need to address that. Right.
And we're over, so please be quick.
Lou Berger, another way to ask that question is, how does the IETF respond to a subpoena to information on GitHub?
Okay, so thank you, you two, and we have some closing remarks, please.
Yeah, hi, Alyssa Cooper. So I thought this was a really fantastic discussion. Thank you, Paul, for initiating it, and all of you for contributing and contributing on the list. I think Yara and I were just sort of chatting about what are the takeaways and the next steps. And it sounds like there's really a few different categories of potential future work here or future areas of exploration. So there's this at the level of the principles, which is kind of encompassed by Mark's document. I think that's one thing. There's, I think, questions around for working groups that are looking to upgrade their tooling or start using GitHub more, but aren't really using it right now. There's obviously a lot of experience now in the IETF, and I think there's questions to explore about how do we make it easier for new people, different people who want to adopt or learn from what we've already learned. How do we make that easier? So, and there's part of that which is about best practices, and part of it which might be about some tooling that we could provide as the IETF. So that's another. The third one gets to Martin's point, I think, about the sort of philosophy of how we develop documents, and for groups that really want to be more on the cutting edge or experimenting with that sort of thing. Again, are there things that we could do to help or make that easier or make it more acceptable in the community or in the groups? That's another one. And then lastly, I do think there was this question raised both by Mike Bishop and by Harold that is a little bit thornier about, does potential adoption of a new tool by some parts of the community imply anything about how we should think about how we gather consensus and how we make decisions, and should the mailing list still rule the day? That's obviously a question that needs a lot more further, deeper thought. I tend to think that even if we go down the path and have a good discussion about that. From the tooling perspective, we always want to make it such that people are able to use the tools that are comfortable for them. I don't hear anybody arguing for let's get rid of or prohibit any tools that we already use, which I think is good. But we're mostly talking about adding and adopting different models for different crowds. But I do think that is like a process point that if people want to debate that, then I encourage you to take that to the mailing list. We're going to keep the mailing list open. And I think for all of those areas that I just listed, probably further debate and discussion on the mailing list is the right next step. If people think there's other things we should do.
Except for the consensus question. I think that one, yeah, and I believe Pete would agree with me, that should be on IETF general. But I think how do you do it? I'm sorry. So we could have it on this mailing list, but then it'll all get repeated on IETF general. So.
Yeah, I don't know. I kind of like when these things start smaller and then go big, especially because it's so bound up with the issue of the tooling, right? Like that's why people want to talk about it. It's not just because they got sick of email.
So another takeaway is then even though this mailing list is called IETF and GitHub, it is somewhat at this point IETF and tooling that seems to lean towards GitHub.
Yeah, I mean, I think the name is okay for now.
Sure.
People want to change it, but a lot of the focus is obviously on GitHub. So yeah. So, please keep contributing on the list and keep the debate going. That's kind of the next step.
Great. Thanks. And keep talking among each other. Again, part of the reason we did this was so that y'all would recognize people from other working groups and stuff to get hints and stuff like that. Come to the mailing list, and whoever has the blue sheets, please bring them up. Thanks. Thank you, sir.
I was waiting for somebody to say, yeah, it's fine, but you really should be testing it.
Yeah, that's right. We didn't give Crocker enough time to do that, so.
My problem is when I learn Git, I forget how to use SVN.
Right. Oh yeah, absolutely.
When I use SVN, I forget
No.
how to use Git.
So I only use a GUI for SVN. And if it doesn't work there, then fuck it.
Well, I need to use it just enough to pull updates on some Perl modules.
Right. And so I have this GUI called Cornerstone that I paid $60 for at some point. And that's all I know about SVN now because it's like trying to do Perl and Python.
I know how to
set
SVN up, but if I had to reestablish it on another computer.
Yeah. Right. Second blue sheet somewhere. Just mail them to me. That's fine. Thanks. Thank you, by the way.
Because it's still not clear to me if people are using GitHub because the tools are good or because they like the service itself.
Very good. Thank you.
Because in the first case, we should discuss alternatives that have having GitLab installed by AMS.
Right.
In the second case, there is no alternative. So is it the service or the tools?
It's both. It's both. It's both. It's some of it is. So some of it really is the pull request thing, which GitHub really does well. But some of it is also this outward facing thing of random people come by or these other people know it and such like that, and which you would never get if you hosted it yourself.
Yeah, but the problem is that it requires one more account. You cannot use your IETF account.
Yeah, big deal. Big deal.
And about recoverability, everyone mentioned it, but how many working groups? That's something missing. How many working groups?
Yeah, almost none.
Actually,
are using it. Almost none. Right. Yes, that one will bite us on the ass, I'm sure. See, I left that. I don't. I'll